Hey folks, I wanted to take a couple minutes and explain to you your research methods assignment because class ended earlier than I hoped and I didn't have a chance to explain to you all the directions, and I want to make sure you can finish it before the next class. So let's go through the directions here. I'm just looking at the same assignment that you got. It says in this assignment you're going to suggest a research method to answer a particular research question, and you should follow the following steps. So for each one of these steps, what I would do is in your notebook put the number of the step and then write down how you would answer that particular section of the assignment. So the first one says write a research question about a social phenomenon that interests you. It says, for example, does hair color affect violent actions? And yours should be more serious. So for example, you can think of a phenomenon that you're interested in, like violence or drug abuse, or college, or really anything at all that you'd like to know how it affects some other particular phenomenon. So, for example, let's say, how does stress affect heart rate? This is one that I have another handout for you for, but we'll say, how does stress affect heart rate? I'm wondering, that's my research question. So for number one, I write, I wonder how stress affects heart rate. Pretty straightforward. And then number two says, write a hypothesis that suggests an answer to your research question. And so this essentially is your educated guess about your question. So I'm thinking stress is probably going to increase heart rate. So that's my hypothesis, right? My hypothesis is increased stress will increase heart rate. Make sense? And then it says label your independent and dependent variables. And so remember, generally speaking, your independent variable comes first, and it's your independent variable that affects your dependent variable. So in this case, your independent variable is stress, and it affects heart rate. Make sense? If you wanted to, for another research question, if you were wondering how levels of poverty affect success in school, right? And in that case, your research question would be, I wonder how poverty affects grades in school, positively or negatively. And then your hypothesis could be, I would imagine that increased levels of poverty have a negative effect on grades, right? And then your independent variable would be poverty, and your dependent variable would be grades. Make sense? Good. Okay, and then it says, and this is one we didn't get a chance to talk about, it says write operational definitions for each of your variables. All operational definition is it specifically says how you are going to measure the variable. So if I'm talking about stress, it says what exactly am I going to use as a stressor? What am I going to call stress? And for example, you could say, I'm going to give people a mild electric shock. Okay, or I'm going to put them in a high stakes testing situation. All right, that's going to be my operational definition for stress, is say the SAT test. Okay, and then for your dependent variable, your operational definition of heart rate would be, say, beats per minute. Right, so you could, and then in your experiment you could say, when kids go in to take the SAT test, we're going to measure their heart rate before the SAT test to get a baseline. And then when they go in and begin taking the test, they'll be hooked up to some sort of pulse monitor, and we'll see what happens to their heart rate. Does that make sense? Good. So in our other example of a hypothesis with poverty and grade level, your operational definition for poverty could be, for example, people who come from families who make less than $18,000 a year. That's your operational definition. Or it could be at a place like MCI, people who qualify for free and reduced lunch is another way to measure poverty. And then for your operational definition for grades could be their cumulative GPA, right? So grades are your variable, in this case your dependent variable, but your operational definition is cumulative GPA. How exactly are you going to measure that variable? Okay, good. And so then it says, suggest one possible intervening variable that could make your correlation spurious. And here you have two new vocab words, right? One is an intervening variable, and two is a spurious correlation. An intervening variable is a third variable that could affect your dependent variable in a way that could mess up your experiment. So for example, if you're talking about how being at the SAT test could affect your heart rate, an intervening variable could be where you were sitting, right? Are you sitting close to the front of the classroom, near a proctor or a teacher, and that might stress you out, right? An intervening variable would be seat placement. An intervening variable could be how much a student had to eat that day, right? If they were hungry, maybe they're going to be more stressed out. An intervening variable could be lighting, right? Maybe the lighting isn't good enough and you can't see your paper, and therefore it makes you more stressed out. Really, it can be any other thing that's going to affect your dependent variable. For our hypothesis about how poverty might affect grade point average or grades, an intervening variable could be abuse in the family. It could be could be time of year. Maybe people's grades tend to go up in the spring and down in the winter, which is actually true. So really, intervening variable, any variable that could change your dependent variable in a way that could make your study less reliable or valid. Okay. And then a spurious correlation, right? And this is the last word on number 5. A spurious correlation is a correlation, remember, which is a relationship between two variables, right? Like, for example, poverty goes up and then grade point average goes down, right? That's a correlation. You got poverty and you got grade point average, right? A spurious correlation is a correlation where the independent variable isn't causing the change, right? The intervening variable is, and so if we're talking about poverty affecting grade point average, if it's not actually the poverty that's affecting the grade point average, let's say that the intervening variable is a bad teacher, right? And in your study, it looks like all of these children who are in poverty are having bad grades, but in fact, all the children with bad grades have the same ineffective teacher, and that's what's causing their grades to be bad. Then you have a spurious correlation between the poverty and the low grades, right? And the intervening variable in this case is your bad teacher. Does that make sense? Okay. So suggest one possible intervening variable, a third variable that could change your dependent variable that will cause the correlation to be invalid, to be spurious, to say that it's not actually the independent variable that's causing the change in the dependent variable. Okay, then you select a research method, and this one should be pretty straightforward because these are the vocab terms we were talking about. Some of them we didn't get a chance to discuss, but I think the definitions are pretty straightforward. So then it just says, okay, so how are you going to decide whether or not poverty affects grade point average, or how stress is going to affect heart rate? So you pick a research method, and I got ethnography, and ethnography is when you put yourself within the environment that you're studying, you spend a long time, and you take careful notes. So if you want to check poverty and grade point average, then you spend lots of time hanging out with families in poverty and interviewing them, and you spend a lot of time with families who are not in poverty and interviewing them, and continually talk about grades and their progress in school. Okay, that's an ethnography. An interview, pretty straightforward. You're going to sit down with a bunch of kids in poverty, a bunch of kids not in poverty, and you're going to talk with them about their grade point average. Okay, and then the comparative historical method just means you would go through all the records of the grades and all the records of income level and check in history how one might affect the other. Right? Content analysis. Content analysis is like analysis of interviews, analysis of, you could say, analysis of historical testing data, that sort of stuff, or experiment. Experiment is what we looked at with the Stanley Milgram experiment, right? So any of the research methods that we discussed, survey is really straightforward. You can, pick any one of those, and then you move on to number 7, which is where a lot of the details are. And it says, Write a detailed description of how you will carry out your study. You should answer questions such as, and you can just list the letters in your notebook and write down what you're going to do. Who's your target population? Your target population is the large group that you want to get information for, like students in America, right? And then where are you going to conduct your study, right? And then you just pick a city like Pittsfield, Maine. Over how long are you going to conduct your study? You know, if you were doing an ethnography and you were putting yourself within these groups of people, you may want to stay there for 3 to 6 months, right? If you're doing a survey, right, you may be able to bang out the whole survey in one day, all right, like we do at MCI. And then how are you going to select your sample, right? And remember, the best way you can get a valid and reliable sample is random selection, right? You don't have to do a random selection. You could say if you're going to study, if you wanted to study students around the world and you were going to use MCI as a sample, you could just say, I'm going to study all students at MCI and give them this survey, right? And then if you're conducting an experiment, how are you going to establish a control group? And remember, an experiment, it's best if you can have a control group, a group where everything else remains the same except your independent variable, right? And so if you were going to test the effects of, say, stress on heart rate, right, you would have one group of people taking the SAT and then one group of people in chairs in the gym at the same time of day not taking the test, right? And then you could eliminate things like a lighting or seating position, that sort of stuff, to see if it's really the stress that's affecting your heart rate. If you're writing a survey or conducting an interview, what specific questions are you going to ask, right? That's pretty straightforward. If you're going to do a survey, what are your questions? And write them down, please. If you're using comparative historical method, which particular sources are going to use, right? Are you going to use the grades on file that we have at MCI, right? If you're going to look at, say, the property value of the houses people lived in to gauge poverty, which you may be able to get a hold of at the town office. If you're conducting a content analysis, what particular sources and variables such as words are you going to look for? And so, like content analysis, you know, let's say you're looking, let's say you're studying newspapers, that's your content, and you're going to analyze whether or not during an election year there's more or less mentions of terrorism, right? And so election year is your independent variable, mentions of terrorism is your dependent variable. And so what you do when you go through the newspaper, right, is you're specifically looking at the dates of the newspaper, and then the words you're looking for are terrorism, right? And you're going to see if there's a correlation between those two. And then what ethical issues should you think about before conducting your study? Really what they're asking for here, and when you're talking about ethics, is whenever you're conducting a study, you need to make sure that you are not hurting people. Or if you are hurting people, you know, like giving them electric shocks, like in the Stanley Milgram experiment, you're minimizing the amount of pain. So they don't actually give the student in the Milgram experiment electric shocks, but they do shock the test subject, the person coming in who doesn't actually know the nature of the experiment, but they make sure the shock's minimized. The other huge ethical issue with that study we watched on TV, the Milgram experiment, that they didn't talk about, and that you should if you suggest a study like that, is imagine you're one of these people, and at the end of the experiment, you realize that you just killed somebody because you took some orders, right? How does that make you feel? And it makes you feel pretty crappy, would be my guess. And so when you're talking about an experiment, or when you're talking about conducting an experiment, you want to minimize the negative impact on your population, on your experimental group. And that's something you should really take into consideration if you're doing things like showing people how they could be a murderer. Okay? Does that make sense? And then the last one, how specifically are you going to present your findings? This could be, you know, for example, I'm going to make a chart, that shows in a line graph the relationship between poverty and grades, or in a line graph the relationship between stress and heart rate, right? Does that make sense? Or you could say I'm going to publish it in, a short essay. Uh, let's see, how else could you do that? You could say I'm going to make a film about it, like like the Milgram experiment did, et cetera, et cetera. So I welcome any questions. Send me an email. I realize there's a lot going on here, and that we didn't have a chance to specifically talk about it in class, but hopefully this video will be helpful. And then send me an email if you have any questions, and I'll get right back to you. Thanks. Good luck. Hey folks, I wanted to take a couple minutes and explain to you your research methods assignment, because class ended earlier than I hoped and I didn't have a chance to explain to you all the directions, and I want to make sure you can finish it before the next class. So let's go through the directions here. I'm just looking at the same assignment that you got. It says in this assignment you're going to suggest a research method to how does stress affect heart rate. This is one that I have another handout for you for, but we'll say, how does stress affect heart rate? I'm wondering, that's my research question. So for number one, I write, I wonder how stress affects heart rate. Pretty straightforward. And then number two says, write a hypothesis that suggests an answer to your research question. And so this essentially is your educated guess about your question. So I'm thinking stress is probably going to increase heart rate. So that's my hypothesis, right? My hypothesis is increased stress will increase heart rate. Make sense? And then it says label your independent and dependent variables. And so remember, answer a particular research question, and you should follow the following steps. So for each one of these steps, what I would do is in your notebook, put the number of the step, and then write down how you would answer that particular section of the assignment. So the first one says, write a research question about a social phenomenon that interests you. It says, for example, does hair color affect violent actions? And yours should be more serious. So for example, you can think of a phenomenon that you're interested in, like violence or drug abuse, or college, or really anything at all that you'd like to know how it affects some other particular phenomenon. So for example, let's say, how does